Hi everybody, welcome to Men's Mental Health. I'm Dr. D, and today we're going to start part one of mood disorders. It's going to be in two parts. First one today is going to be about depressive disorders, and next one is going to be about bipolar disorders. So we're going to be going through some charts, and first up, I want to take a look at what would be considered kind of an average mood. First up, I want to take a look at what would be considered kind of an average mood. And if you see the scales, it goes from -10 to 10. And that's just a subjective scaling that I use with my clients from 0 to 10. How are they doing? How's their mood going? And it gives me an idea of where they're at. So there's nothing magical about those numbers from -10 to 10. It just is a representation to give you a visual impression of what these different disorders look like. Now, taking a look at the one that says average mood, you'll see that it kind of goes from about -2, -3 on up to +2 or 3. So that would be pretty typical for a range in the average mood area. One thing I want to point out before we get rolling, this isn't intended to self-diagnose. If you, friend, family member has depression, you want to encourage that person to seek help, get that professional help, because oftentimes there's suicidal thoughts involved, maybe even suicide attempts. So it's not something to mess around with. Get professional help as needed. Okay, so the first one up is major depressive disorder. And if you take a look at that slide, you're going to see there's like a big drop, a big dip in there. That's that major depressive episode. And it takes a minimum of 2 weeks with 5 of the following 9 symptoms. And one of those 5 must be either feeling a depressed mood or a loss of interest in things that you would normally enjoy. The other symptoms include changes in appetite. So it's typically a loss of appetite, but sometimes it's overeating. And another thing is that it could be a significant weight loss without trying to lose weight, like 5% of your body weight or more. Next one is trouble sleeping, and typically that's going to be insomnia. Okay, so it's going to be where you're not getting the normal, typical 8 hours, 7, 8, 9 hours of sleep that you would normally get. Some people will oversleep. Next one is feeling this physical agitation or a lack of activity. Next is feeling fatigue. You just don't have energy to do anything. Then there could be feelings of hopelessness, thoughts of hopelessness, worthlessness, helplessness. Those are words that people will commonly use with me. Next one up is trouble concentrating and or making decisions. And then finally, suicidal ideations, thoughts of death and dying, could be suicide plans, even suicide attempts. So it's got to be 5 of those 9 symptoms to be considered a major depressive episode. And it's during a 2-week period, minimum 2 weeks. Now you're getting into what's called a major depressive disorder. And before we move on to the next one, there's a couple things I want to go over with you. One is that it typically starts in early adulthood. It can start at any age, but typically it's in early adulthood, like early 20s. In any 1-year period, about 1 out of 14 people will have a major depressive disorder. And then finally, on average, people recover from a major depressive disorder in 3 to 12 months. All right, next up is persistent depressive disorder, also called dysthymia. 2 names for the same diagnosis. And today's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders identifies it as persistent depressive disorder. So remember back on the first slide where the average mood was around a 0, up and down a little bit around the 0. Well, with persistent depressive disorder, that average mood is just a little bit down, like around a -2, maybe a -3, somewhere just a little bit down. Not way down like 7, 8, 9, just a little bit down below the average. And actually think of the Winnie the Pooh character Eeyore. Well, he actually gives us a good idea of what persistent depressive disorder looks like. So people, to get this diagnosis, they have to have that lower average for a minimum of 2 years, or if they're under 18, a minimum of 1 year. Another thing is that it typically starts anywhere from childhood to early adulthood, the early 20s. And when I'm working with people like this, they typically tell me, well, this is just how I've always been. I've always felt this way. They don't see it as a problem. They just see it, to them, it's their normal. So let's take a look at what the symptoms are. First of all, they got to have that down mood more days than not for that 2-year period, or 1 year if they're under 18. Then they're going to have that change in appetite, typically a loss of appetite, but not always. It could be overeating. Same thing with sleep. Loss of sleep, that insomnia, or it could be oversleeping. Third would be low energy or fatigue, just not having the energy to do things that they would normally enjoy. Fourth up is low self-esteem, like pretty much seeing the negative in things, not finding the positive. Then they're going to have those thoughts of hopelessness, and I'll hear them say worthlessness, helplessness as well. Last one, trouble concentrating and or making decisions. A couple things I want to go over on these two diagnoses. First of all, the person can never have had a manic or hypomanic episode in their lifetime. And that's going to be part 2 of the videos on mood disorder. The other thing is that these disorders can be mild, moderate, severe, or severe with psychotic features. And the way we kind of delineate is how many of those symptoms do they have, and how distressing are the symptoms, how much of an impact, a negative impact, is it having on their life, those functional impairments. 2 more diagnoses for us to go through on the depressive disorders. First one is Disruptive Mood Dysregulation Disorder, and this is where the person has a pattern of abrupt outbursts, anger, irritability. So let's take a look at the symptoms and behaviors that go along with this one. Now, the person having those abrupt outbursts, they can be either verbal or physical, and they're always going to be out of proportion to whatever the situation was. Additionally, they have to have a minimum of 3 per week. And the periods during those outbursts, the time in between those outbursts, that person is just angry and or irritable throughout that time. The diagnosis is always between the age of 6 to 18, and at least one of the symptoms must start before the age of 10. And it has to be ongoing for at least 12 months before the diagnosis is given. Additionally, it has to be in more than one situation. For instance, if a person is having these outbursts at home and nowhere else, that's not this diagnosis. It's got to be home, school, in the community, some combination of different environments. So as you're hearing this, you might be thinking, oh, that's just a typical teenager you're talking about, which is something we as professionals have to figure out. Is it within the normal developmental situation of where the person is? Or is it above and beyond that? Okay, last one, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. The woman has to have at least 5 of the following symptoms in the week prior to menses. Then the symptoms subside during the menses, and they become minimal or even absent in the week post-menses. So at least one of those 5 must be among the following: mood swings, irritable, angry, conflicts in relationships, could be depressed mood, hopelessness, or negative thoughts, or it could be anxiety, tension, or feeling on edge. It has to be at least one of those 4. Next one, and then those 5 need to be at least one of the following: loss of interest in things that they would normally enjoy, trouble concentrating or making decisions, feeling fatigued or having low energy, that change in appetite. So typically it's a loss of appetite, but it could be overeating, or it could be cravings as well. And then changes in sleep, insomnia or oversleeping. And then they could be feeling overwhelmed or out of control. And they could have physical symptoms where their breasts were feeling tender or swelling. They might have some joint pain, some muscle pain, could be bloating, could be weight gain. So there must be a total of 5 symptoms minimum of that whole group, and at least one must be from the first grouping and one must be from the second grouping. So this disorder can begin at any age. In any given year, about 1 out of 70 women will have this disorder, and it's not the same as premenstrual syndrome. So PMS is not as severe, not as intense, doesn't have the same exact symptoms and about 1 out of 5 women are going to go through premenstrual syndrome. So there's a quick overview of depressive disorders: major depressive disorder, persistent depressive disorder, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Keep in mind, this is not intended to diagnose. And if you, a friend, loved one, is going through any of these things, having suicidal thoughts, coming up with suicidal plans, or made a suicide attempt, get that professional help. Don't delay. Again, I want to thank you for joining me. I'm Dr. D. This is Men's Mental Health, and I'll see you next time. All right, so thank you for joining me today, and I appreciate you taking the time. If you like this, please hit subscribe, like, and if you have ideas of things you want to hear about in the future, please let me know. One thing, keep in mind, this is not therapy itself. These are tools, techniques that therapists often use. And if you find that you need some help, you're struggling with some things, check in the description of steps to do, because if you need therapy, help is out there.